Welcome to Psyched, and this is a show where every Wednesday we talk about different psychological applications or the study of psychology in general and application in the workplace. And Andrea Chu, welcome to the show. Thanks for continuing grace our presence. So tell us about what we're going to talk about this week, because it seems very exciting, and I think we've got a super exciting guest who will be joining us today. Where we're going to talk about dishonesty, right? Talk us through that, Andrea.
All right, so I think this is a topic that very, very apt for what's happening in Malaysia and what's happening around us. We always hear the word lying, liars, dishonesty, and all these things and negative effects of that and stuff like that. And we've watched a lot of movies and, crime detection shows and stuff like that to see who's actually lying. If the buzzer, starts buzzing when you put your hand in, then you're lying, right? And there's a lot of things that is going around this topic. And we have an excellent person who is an expert in these kind of things, and she will talk about the dark triad. So for those who are watching right now, if you know what the dark triad is, just comment below and let us know what you think the dark triad is. All right, so I think that's what we're going to dive deep into, and we're so excited to show you some serial killers as well. And I hope that Roshan is also as excited as I am about this topic.
Interesting, but when we talk about liars, I only can think about our government, but never mind. I mean, that beside that. So we're gonna go, and are we gonna be talking a little bit about the topic, or we want to bring in the guest right away? Because I'm super excited. I just heard she's a forensic psychologist. So and a couple of guests who joined us. I think Andrea's Don, who's a psychologist, NLP trainer also. Andrea's great to be here. And great to have you here. Nice to be here. Looking forward to the learning. And then also Charlotte, I think, also says, hey, interesting topic you guys are covering. Keen to hear about this. So we're going to talk about lying, and shall we lie to everybody? No, we're not going to do that. So introduce us to this whole dark triads. What is it about?
Okay, so before we go into the dark triad, we leave the expert to talk about dark triad, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about the research that comes with lying. So there's one research that shows that actually people lie about 25% of their interactions with others. So I'm going to ask Roshan, I'm going to put him on the spot. Have you lied in the past 2 days?
Hard to say, maybe to get my kids to eat their food or something. Yeah, I hard to even recall. But if it's true, 1 in 4 interactions, well, that's quite staggering, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine. And obviously there is not disclosing fully, maybe a form of lying, I guess, and we can talk a little bit about that, right? Yes. Andrea's response, dark triad is narcissism, materialism, and psychopathy. Psychopathy. So he's right on, right? So let's talk a little bit about guests today. Who do we have joining us?
All right, so we have Dr. Kai Li. She is the Deputy Head of Section for Psychology in University of Reading, Malaysia. She is also a lecturer in many, many areas in psychology, including forensic psychology, social psychology, and especially into personality as well. So she's going to talk to us about the dark triad. But before that, we have a very quick video to show all of you and see whether that piques your interest into the topic a little bit further.
All right, so let's watch this little video.
He didn't look like anybody's notion of somebody who would tear apart young girls.
My name is Ted Bundy. I've never spoken to anybody about this. I am looking for an opportunity to tell the story as best I can.
A person of this type chooses his victim for a reason. Possession, control, violence.
There was something unique about Ted's brain. He talked in terms of a voice in his head, and this voice would start saying things about women.
He had very blue eyes. When he really got going, his eyes went absolutely black.
Murder, leaving a person of this type hungry, unfulfilled, would also leave him with the obviously irrational belief that the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled. And the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled. Or the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled.
Theodore Bundy has escaped, suspected of dozens of sex killings in Washington State, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado.
I think things are going to work out. That's about all I can say.
Bundy is acting as his own lawyer. What is unusual to see is that many of the onlookers are women. Are you a little scared when you look at him?
He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody.
Serial killer Theodore Bundy has escaped once again. One of the FBI's most wanted men.
He was charming, good looking, smart. Are you sure you have the right guy?
I mean, I'm not an animal and I'm not crazy. I'm a split personality. I mean, I'm just a normal individual.
All right. And that's a creepy documentary that everybody should watch.
You're starting us out, freaking us all out, right?
That's good, right?
Yeah, I mean, Ted Bundy is a notorious liar and a murderer and really violent. I don't know why Aaron says, "Wow, that smile." I think, are you talking about Ted Bundy's smile, Aaron? But one of the things I think is interesting. We're talking about lying, especially people that you cannot detect, right? I guess one thing interesting is for yourselves. I mean, if you're watching right now, how likely are you to tell your boss what they want to hear or lying to them just to get away with it? And we're going to get back to this topic in a bit. But one of the things I think that is interesting that you were sharing, Andrea, is about lying. There's actually 4 types of liars out there, right? And this is some work by Nir Eval, right? That has this work. Can you share with us what that means?
Okay, all right. So I think we have a very interesting diagram it shows, right? People lie about mainly 2 things. One is either they are trying to distort a fact, that means they're lying about a fact, or they're lying about their values, right? So there's this little cute diagram that shows how exactly these 4 types of liars work. So there's the deceitful ones, that they will lie about the facts to others. And then there's the delusional one who lies about the facts to themselves. And then there is something called a duplicitous liar who lies about their values, but to others. And demoralized, they lie about their values to themselves. So actually lying is not just about lying to, your another person. It's also lying to yourself. It's also a lie. But the thing is that when we watch about, Ted Bundy, it really is interesting that a lot of the traits that they mention about Ted Bundy were things like charming. He will be able to say the right things to the women to get them thinking about certain things. So he was lying to others about certain facts and about certain values. But at one point, in the video, he says, "I'm not crazy. I don't have a split personality. I'm just a normal individual." That could be a possible lying to himself, right? He didn't see the action that he did. But then we also talk about psychopathy, which is also part of, the dark triad. And we talk about usually psychopathic killers are usually pathological liars at a certain age, especially when they were teens. So we have a very quick energizer we want to show you and see whether you can guess who these people are. And while we welcome Dr. Kai Li into the team, and then we talk about the dark triad a little bit more. So let's see the 3 images and comment if you know who these people are. Can you guess these serial killers? These are very famous serial killers, and when they did, biographies about these people and interviews, they've seen that they have been lying since they were at a very young age, and that was one of the traits in psychopathy. Manipulation, lying, deceit, and stuff like that. So comment in the comment section below if you know. And as we welcome Dr. Kai Li, I think the first question I would ask her is, what is a pathological liar? Or, is there a relationship between dishonesty and psychopathy in the dark triad?
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. When we talk about pathological liar, it's almost as if it's a condition that somebody has. Lying is actually a tendency. So thanks very much, Andrea, for bringing up the idea of personality traits. So if you think about, you and I, everybody has, we have personality. And if you think about personality as a continuum, so, to a certain extent, everybody has traits of psychopathy. Everybody has some traits of narcissism, which is part of the dark triad. But we vary in terms of how we are placed on this continuum. So, if a person is high on psychopathy, for example, there will be some characteristics that are very telling of this particular trait. And if you're low on that particular personality trait, it means that you will portray certain tendencies that are low on that. So when you talk about psychopathy, for example, you talk about tendencies of lying. So yes, that's indeed true. Psychopaths it's sort of like not really politically correct to call people psychopaths in our area of research, because seeing that people have these traits to varying extent, we need to say that people who are on the slightly higher tendency to have psychopathy, they and I think you can see on the graph here, they tend to be remorseless and emotionally cold and impulsive. So these traits are sort of the telling traits of a person who is high on psychopathy. That means that if they were to tell you a lie, they don't feel any sense of remorse. They don't feel that it's anything bad, and because of that emotional coldness, they don't feel guilty at all. So that's that's why people who are high on these traits are able to commit very unpleasant acts. It doesn't have to be crime. We talk about killers, and we talk about it in a very sort of sensationalized, but actually people who are high on psychopathy can commit white collar crimes, for example. They be dishonest in school. They can academic dishonesty, for example, and they can also be quite emotionally cold in terms of day-to-day relationships. So there's sort of a wide range of contexts in which people who are high on certain traits are more likely to behave in a certain way that may not be socially pleasant, or that we feel that they tend to be socially aversive. That's what we say.
All right, and I think that's a very interesting point that a lot of people who do not really study psychology or not understand the industry would think that you are either A or B, right? Type A, type B, this is who you are, this is your personality, it's pretty much fixed, you're born with it. So all these are really myths that we have debunked over many, many years of studying, personality. And I like this understanding that we are most likely on a spectrum, a continuum, as you call it, right? You might have maybe 1% of psychopathy. That doesn't make you a psychopath. And can you take us through the other 2 traits of the dark triad? Maybe take us through what research has shown, some ideas, some understanding of that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. My PhD thesis was actually on dark triad personality. And in fact, now, it's a constellation of 3 traits, but now we've got an addition. The 4th trait is actually everyday sadism, which means that people who are high on these traits is likely to be, who enjoy or gain pleasure from other people's sufferings. But anyway, we can talk about that in a bit. So like I've said, psychopathy is people who are impulsivity is one of the key characteristics. Narcissism is a very interesting one, because narcissism, to a healthy extent, everybody should be narcissistic to a certain extent, because it's good for our self-esteem. We need to feel good about ourselves. We need to feel that we are respectable. We feel that people admire us. But at the extreme end, again, we're talking about continuum here. At the extreme end, people high on narcissism tend to think that it's all me, myself, and I. The world revolves around them. High on grandiosity. They think that people, perceive themselves as superior, and they need this sort of validation. And you can see a lot of these traits in key leaders of the world. People who think that it's all about me, and what I say is correct. Machiavellianism is also something quite interesting, because Machiavellianism talks about people who disregard morality because there's an end to what do we say, the means to an end. So you do something as a means to an end, meaning that if it's going to be for the greater good, for example, or if there's some reasons why this is it results in a better solution, they are able to disregard morality. So I don't know if you guys are sort of Game of Thrones fans. I am. In Game of Thrones, you can see a lot of this Machiavellianism trait coming out. It's like, maybe for the good of their empire, or maybe for the good of themselves, or for their children, or whoever it is. So when you're high on this Machiavellianism trait, it's okay for you to disregard morality if it means that there's some form of instrumental gain at the end of it. So as you can see, these 3 traits are socially aversive, and to a certain extent, pathological lying, or lying in general, according to research, has been shown to be associated with these 3 traits. So and the interesting thing is that the motivation is different. Like I've explained just now, a person who is highly narcissistic, for example, they may lie because they want to feel admired, or they want to have that superiority feeling. So the motivation is slightly different. Machiavellianism, they may lie because there's sort of an end goal that they're trying to achieve. So in order to achieve that end goal, it doesn't really matter if they're committing crimes, or it doesn't really matter if they're doing something that's inhumane or immoral. But psychopathy is slightly different as well, because there's always an instrumental gain. However, for psychopathy, the fact that they can lie without guilt is because they are impulsive and they lack that sort of emotional aspect of it. And if you look at, for example, in some neuroscience research, when you try and understand the sort of the brain waves of people and how they react when they see something emotional, people high on psychopathy tend to be quite low in terms of the emotional reaction as compared to people who are low on psychopathy. So the fact that they can not feel anything too emotional, when they're lying or when they do something bad, makes them a liar without conscience. Is they feel bad. They don't feel anything if they were to lie. So I hope that's that gives you a bit of information of those 3 traits.
Yes, it does, and it gives a very clear understanding of what it is. I'm going to take some comments from the show. The audience are saying, hopefully I am not delusional. Aaron doesn't say that, and Esther was saying the guy on the right super suspicious. We are talking about the serial killers just now, and Sashi is saying, that was really scary. What he thinks that he's normal. He's talking about Ted Bundy, and what if the way we see ourselves is not exactly how others see us? And I think this is a question that we can pose to you by Charlotte. She asked that, does the brain change over time to believe that your values are the right ones, and it's so difficult to actually work towards a change? And this is something that you mentioned just now about the Machiavellianism, right? Something to do with the way you see things and the values that you hold. So what do you think, from a neuroscience perspective or the research that you've seen?
This is sort of the $1 million question, isn't it? So when we say somebody, right, when if you think about it from a sort of criminal or forensic perspective, for example, if you and I were to give a white lie every day, it doesn't really have massive implications. But in the legal context, lie detection is very important. It's very important if somebody is telling a lie about a particular crime. So whenever you think about it from a sort of legal or criminal perspective, when we say somebody is a pathological liar or somebody who's high on a certain personality trait, what we're really talking about is the culpability of it. So if a person was to be born with such traits, if a person was to be born a born liar, or if it could be some environmental factors as a child where they, it's not really within their control. Probably it's poor parenting. It's an abusive relationship or whatever that is, that shapes that behavior or shapes that personality. So can we still hold this person accountable? So that's really the question that tends to be quite controversial. If we understand personality in terms of a trait that is stable and is unlikely to change across your lifespan, so your past behavior is a good indicator of your future behavior. If you're within this school of thought, then you would think, to answer Charlotte's question, then perhaps there's very little you can do to change people. But there's also this idea of this sort of brain plasticity where, with the good, with sort of where against the nature-nurture argument, isn't it? So can our environment sort of shape our behavior and so on? And that there has been some work looking at if people were in some an environment that is sort of nourishing and encouraging, it doesn't take the trait away, actually. A person with high on psychopathy still has some of those tendencies, but they might be able to flourish in certain environments which is adaptive as well as suitable for the person. Let me give you an example. There is some research that has seen that certain types of career attract certain types of personality traits. So, for example, people who are in the legal field, they tend to be high on some of these traits. People in politics, they've even found that people in the medical sphere, doctors, and they tend to be high on these dark triad traits as well. Is it something for us to be worried about? It really depends, So some people will use some of these traits to do things that are not pleasant. But at the same time, these traits are important because if you look at the way that we measure these traits, some of them talk about charisma. Some of them talk about decision making, fast decision making. And these are very, very important traits when you are in this sort of high stakes situation, you don't want a leader who is, I'm not really sure. Maybe we can sleep on it. Maybe we can decide tomorrow. You don't want somebody who can't make quick decisions. So sometimes there are difficult decisions where you need somebody who is probably emotionally cold, who can make those fast decisions without feeling guilty or feeling that it's going to upset somebody. So these traits are adaptive to a certain extent. Obviously, some people will use this to, for good, and some people will use it for other reasons. And I think, when we talk about, for example, people who do end up in situations where they are in brutal crimes or violent and violent crimes, it's also partly the environment that has shaped them. If you look at the criminology literature, they call it a criminal career. It's like a career where you start off in a situation where you slowly build your career to be a criminal. I know that happens in white collar crimes as well. But I think, it's easy for us to fall into the trap to think that psychopaths must be violent, crazy people, but actually, people in the audience, maybe some of us may be high on psychopathy, and that doesn't necessarily, mean that you are a person determine that you're going to be a person that is scary or going to be troublesome to other people.
And I think that's very true. I always think that I'm quite high on psychopathy. That's a joke that happens with my friends when we're in psychology. We're like, are you a psychopath or a sociopath? And we argue about that a lot. And I agree, at some points, it'll be very interesting, for Leaderonomics itself to do a bit of research on whether leaders in high stakes situations have high levels of this dark triad personality traits. There is something really cool. And there are a few comments coming in as well. Matthew says he got to start watching GOT now. And there's another question from Sashi.
Really violent,
a lot of power-driven people over there. And there's this question by Sashi. He asked this: can lying be considered a survival skill?
I think, thanks very much, Shashi, for that question. I think lying is common, right? You and I lie about things all the time, and there's a lot of there's various motivation as to why we do it. And I mentioned just now, in some high stakes condition, lying is sort of essential, because if, let's say, you were caught to commit a crime, the motivation is to avoid being caught or avoid being convicted. So lying is very, very common, and the thing is that there's some theories to explain whether or not lying, like, for example, it's concealment. I think just now Roshan mentioned something. If I'm not telling you the entire truth, is concealment considered a lie? And various school of thoughts thinking or not whether that's important. So ideally, we don't want somebody who is lying constantly. But like I said, lying is common, but it does not always cause dysfunctionality, right? So there are certain conditions. When you think about something that is potentially pathological or potentially problematic, we always think in terms of whether or not it's dysfunctional to this person's context. So does it affect your relationships? Does it affect your work relationships? Does it affect the way in which you carry yourself? And if it does not reach that extent, there's very little that we can be worried about. Sometimes your children may be lying to you because they're afraid of getting caught or being punished. That doesn't make them a terrible person. You want to try and understand what are the motivations behind those behavior.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Dr. Kai Li. I think I have a few more comments coming in from the audience. Matthew says, "Wow, doctors, that is scary." And Aaron asks, how important is it for managers to be aware of this topic? Also, what sort of changes can one bring knowing about dark triad? I will tell Aaron Dawson, stay tuned. We're going to go right into that, application in the workplace. And then Charlotte says, born liar, does this really exist? Because that can really turn out nasty as the individual grows up. I think Dr. Kai Li mentioned, it really depends on the continuum the person is at with this kind of personality traits. And this is something interesting that Joanne is asking. She said that some people associate autism with psychopathy, and she asked whether she can get your view. What are your views or research on that?
I'm not an expert in autism, so that's more of a developmental psychology bit, so I won't be able to comment much on that. But if you're interested in my view, autism is a developmental disorder in a way that somebody has some form of difficulties in sort of day-to-day interactions, and that the motivations behind doing some of the things that they do is not necessarily related to psychopathy. The relationship that you see is because of what we call theory of mind. So theory of mind is somewhat related to being in other people's shoes and empathy, and whether or not you are able to read somebody's emotions and react accordingly. So for example, if Andrea is going to make a really upset face now, and I continue to talk as if I've got no regard of what she's doing, and I have the inability to sort of interpret that emotions. And that's something that there has some research that have been found that people who are high on psychopathy seem to have a little bit of difficulty in interpreting other people's emotions. And therefore, they can't really get that cue, and therefore they react, they behave the way they do. And that's similar to autism in a way that people who are diagnosed with sort of autism disorder is that they tend to they're unable to read certain emotions and react accordingly. So I think that is perhaps as close as they can be. Autism is not a personality trait according to the psychology field, and as opposed to psychopathy is treated as a sort of personality traits that you and I have, and they are stable across the lifespan, and we vary in terms of high and low. So that's very, very different from how you would define autism.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much for a very thorough explanation. And I think to add on to that, I'm watching this series called The Good Doctor, where this doctor is autistic, and it's very interesting because usually if you look at symptoms only, then you would see that as an association. But if you look at a keyword that Dr. Kai Li has been mentioning over like the past 5 minutes was motivation, right? And if you have not watched the series, I recommend you to watch it, and you can see what actually happens with his thoughts versus his behavior and how you can see it. So I think the next question, as we move into the application, so how do we actually catch liars or know that this person is lying? We watch a lot of movies about polygraphs, lie detection buzzers and all that, and this I understanding that if the body language shows something, that means this person is lying. So what is your thought on that?
If you look at the research, you and I, everybody are terrible lie detectors. We say that, I can read somebody's, if somebody was telling lies, but in actual fact, we are very, very poor lie detectors. And we are only about chance level when it comes to trying to identify if somebody is lying. And there are various reasons for that. And even police officers, people who are in the high stakes conditions where part of their job, detecting lies is a very key thing of their jobs. Even people in those professions are no better than a naive person like you and I, a lay person, to detect lies. So that's one thing we want to get out of the way. So how do we better able to catch lies? And I can only share this in a sort of more forensic context. So I apologize because I'm not industrial organizational psychologist, so I won't be able to give any comments on that. But in terms of the legal context and the sort of forensic psychology framework, people body language is actually quite a poor cue for us to detect lies. Why? If you ask a person, if let's say you strap somebody under a lie detector and they're really, really nervous, okay, and usually it's because they've committed a crime, and you want to ask them, did you commit the crime? Did you know the victim, and so on? They may portray various physiological arousal, which is what the polygraph or the lie detection is actually measuring. They're measuring changes in your breathing, changes in your heart rate, your blood pressure, and so on. But you know that under these contexts, imagine yourself being detained in a police station where you're terrified. It's in the middle of the night. You've got no family around you. You and I will also have that sort of physiological arousal. And that's the problem with it. How do you determine whether or not a person is just having those physiological arousal because they're guilty and they're afraid of being caught, or because they're just genuinely nervous and they're afraid that even though they have not done it, they're being caught? So the polygraph test has been known to be a very unreliable test, and I think I've spoke to some psychology officers from the prison in the past week, and I think in the police, in the court system, it's not considered an admissible evidence to use lie detector, which I'm really grateful of, because it's not a reliable or accurate measure of lying. But one thing, according to the research, has found that verbal cues are actually quite a reliable way of detecting. So for example, if what do you think a liar is motivated to do? A liar doesn't want to be caught. So what would a liar do in order to make sure that they don't get caught? So if if the average person think that, the reason why the person is lying is because the person is avoiding eye contact with me. So the liar knows that you rely on eye contact to determine whether or not the person is telling a lie. They would just make eye contact with you constantly, so that you won't be able to tell whether or not the person is telling a lie. So that the thing is that these cues that we rely on, fidgeting, looking somewhere else, touching their hair. Everybody does this, and this is not really because they're lying or because it's an accurate cue. But what they have found is that verbal cues are the better way of trying to identify somebody, because a liar will try to stick to what they know as much as they can. They won't say anything more because they're afraid that it might come back and bite them. They're afraid that if I say more, you'll ask me more, and my story will not sort of tally and it will not match. So if you want to really find out if a person is lying, ask questions. Ask them if, let's say, you want to know, okay, can you tell me what happened yesterday? And they told you a story. Usually it's fairly short. And then you say, can you tell me more about this incident? They might struggle to give you more information because it has not happened. Another interesting thing that in the literature suggests is that you go backwards. You ask them to recall the story in a backward manner. So, what happened last, going back. What this idea does is that it imposes what we call a cognitive load. Lying is cognitively demanding. It means that you have to think about your lie. You have to make very careful. Your words have to be careful so that you don't get caught. And therefore, it's cognitively demanding. And if you impose more cognitive load, they will struggle, and therefore they would be able to show sort of pitfalls of their lying. So long story short, verbal cues are better than non-verbal cues when it comes to lie detection. And we are terrible lie detectors.
Yes, I agree. We are terrible lie detectors. As much as we watch Lie to Me and pretend to look at, micro expressions and stuff like that, we still miss it out. And I really agree with, verbal cues. So we usually play something called Two Truths and One Lie a lot with ice-breaking sessions. And I actually sort of tested this theory out, whether I could look at somebody at the same time, listen to what they say and figure out whether they're lying. And I realized that people who know that they are supposed to lie, because that's the objective of the game, their lie usually is much more detailed than the truth, which is a very interesting verbal cue that I never really, thought about. I thought if you have more details, then you would know more, and that is the truth. But interestingly, it's not. So I think
I think, sorry, I wanted to add, I think what we want to sort of take home message is that there's no Pinocchio's nose. You cannot rely solely on one particular cue and to expect to be able to be a good detector. So it has to be multiple cues. I'm not saying that verbal cues are not telling, but non-verbal cues are not telling, but you get a 50% chance of getting it right normally, according to research. So verbal cues are better. You've got a better chance if you rely on verbal cues.
So in other words, consistency with using various types of cues is how you detect a bit more accurately.
If you are looking in terms of the literature, they would actually recommend that you rely on verbal cues, because I thought you were talking about consistency. A liar will be fairly inconsistent in what they say. They can be consistent in their non-verbal behavior, their expressions, but in terms of verbal cues, because to explain something that has not happened, or to explain something, to tell a lie about something, it relies a lot on details, and which these people may not necessarily have.
That's very interesting. So I have a few comments here. Sashi says, oops, he always thought he was a good lie detector until today. It's much more complex than he thought. And there's another question from Charlotte, before we move on to application with Roshan, is how does one identify if the person is high on being delusional versus being naive with no intention to lie or deceive? So I think this is a question of how do we look at the motivations behind the lying or the non-lying.
I'm not a practitioner psychologist, so I'm afraid I won't be able to sort of explain this. Delusional is I'm slightly disagreeing with the sort of typing when you say somebody who is delusional or immoral. So I'm not familiar with that sort of framework as well. Delusional, we talk. There's sort of always some form of that's what we call somebody who likes to make things up, and usually there's some form of background history with that. So it's usually somebody who has some form of disordered thinking that causes them to be paranoid, for example, or delusional. So that is more of a pathology versus somebody with no intention to lie. In terms of whether or not you can identify somebody, I think you need to base it on like sort of behavior in the past as well. And this is sort of like ground truth, if somebody were to tell you a lie and you only have a 50% chance of getting it right, you will never know, because this is, I always say, only God knows. We won't know. If somebody has an intention to tell you a lie and they're quite convincing about it, who are you to sort of, I feel that I'm unable to answer it, because in the reality of our situation is that we will never know ground truth. So even if a person who has been convicted of a crime says that they have not done it, or says that they have done it, or whatever it is, the only way you can match is through hard evidence, whether or not there's DNA evidence. But without that, it's only what you take what is on a surface level. So you can't really be able to sort of identify that. So I'm afraid, I'm sorry, Charlotte, I'm not well equipped to answer that question.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kai Li. All right, so we have Roshan coming in. He has a question for you in terms of the workplace. Can we bring Roshan back in?
Hey, good to be. It's such an interesting conversation, and I think before I don't think we properly introduced you, Dr. Chung, just now, because you are a forensic psychologist, right? And I, when you first told me that your dad, I'm like, huh, what do you do, right? Maybe you can share a little bit about that. I want to bring this a little bit more practical and try to see what this all means for us in the workplace, right? Maybe you can share a bit about being a forensic psychologist.
First of all, I wanted to clarify, Roshan, a forensic psychologist in the UK is a protected title. In Malaysia, there's no regulations yet. So I hardly identify myself as a forensic psychologist. I practice in forensic psychology, and I research in forensic psychology, and I teach in forensic psychology. But that's a great question. I think people always tend to misunderstand when they say forensic. People think about forensic science, it's about solving crimes, it's about CSI. Forensic actually just means related to the law. So any intersection between psychology and the law is what I do. So the few dimensions that the kind of work that you can be involved in is like policing, victimology, criminal behavior is one of them. What is that called? Correctional psychology, dealing with prisoners and people who are rehabilitated and so on, as well as risk assessment, risk assessment like developmentally, if a person is likely to be a criminal and whatnot. So there's a few range of things that are involved. What I do in University of Reading is I do a little bit with policing. So how and part of what I do is investigative interviewing. So when a person is being held in custody and there will be some questioning involved, how do we make sure that that process is fair, so that we're not disadvantaging somebody? So I think it's very important for us to remember that the criminal justice system is making sure that it's fair and it's not putting somebody at an advantage or a disadvantage. So I do work in investigative interviewing, also especially in child investigative interviewing. So if there was an alleged abuse case and a child is being brought into an interviewing situation, how do we ensure that the child is providing information that is sufficient, not contaminated, that can be used in court? So this is part of what I do. I mentioned that my area is in dark triad in my thesis. So another area that I'm interested in, and that's largely what I do in my research, is personality traits and interpersonal violence. So part of it is, relationships, domestic violence cases and so on. So in terms of application in the workplace, we know that some of these traits doesn't necessarily relate to violent behavior. It could be aggressive behavior where it's not really pleasant. So, think about cases where you've got superiors or who are, really, really unpleasant. They say things that are insulting. They don't care for anything. They don't care about well-being. And these are some traits that are quite telling in the workplace. I think there was a question just now, talking about how do we identify these people and what is the implications of identifying these?
Right.
And I think It's really tricky because just now I mentioned that some of these traits are important, right? I know that certain companies use screening processes in the recruitment stage, where you see there are tendencies of people who are likely to show counterproductive work behavior. So counterproductive work behavior, whether or not they'll be on time, whether or not they will be, potentially there will be theft in the company and so on. Yeah.
Yep.
But the tricky bit of this is that we always have this tendency to answer something in a socially desirable way. So, when you think about, if I were to be, and some people even really proudly say, I can just cheat myself, if I think they want to hear that I'm a really productive and a conscientious worker. So I'll just answer it accordingly. And, some people don't answer it honestly, which is our topic today. And I think this is something that is the problem with a lot of self-reported behavior, which is, I think at this point, we don't really have the technology to identify it yet. So it's just a limitation that we have to live with.
The big question, and I think this was a point made earlier on, is like if 25% of most people's interaction are not truths, or half truths, that means it's quite rampant in the workplace, all right? So how much of it do we allow, and what sort of acceptability levels are acceptable and not, right? Because we know it's rampant, we know it's happening. We know there is, and we talk about white lies all the time. And, things like what's acceptable and what's not. But I know understanding that it's whether it's a lie or not is important. But what should we be doing in the workplace to is it to mitigate it or to accept it? Is it like COVID? We just have to. It's an endemic. We just have to live with it and manage. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks very much for that question, Roshan. I feel that it's a difficult position to be in. For yourself, I think you run a company and you manage it, and these are things that you would not encourage and you would not want it, because again, research has shown that this type of counterproductive work behavior drives down productivity, and it's not something that people want. I think part of it is a work culture that's really, really important, and organizational culture is really important. And I think in cultures where it is acceptable, it's acceptable for people to get away with things without any consequences of doing it. It sends a message to people that this is acceptable and therefore we can just go along with it. I'm sure all of us here will have worked with somebody who was great and somebody who has been terrible. And you can see the difference in how it shapes the sort of behavior amongst yourself. And I think again, there are certain times where sort of white lies are acceptable. It's about being flexible as well. If let's say, there would be like sort of big things where bribery or corruption or things like that would be considered unacceptable. But there's a little bit things as long, I lied about being late to work today because something happened. And I talk about motivation a little bit because I think once you've identified that somebody's telling lies, it's always useful to find out why, and if you think about it from a social exchange theory, it's like people always do something for some instrumental gain. And if let's say they are doing it because they want something to be achieved at the end, is it because the company is not giving them that thing to achieve in the end, that they feel that they have to do other things in order to avoid being punished or whatever? But obviously you've got people who are problematic. We have problematic work behaviors as well. In those kinds of situations, sometimes, unfortunately, there's really no way around it. There are cases where you need to make really tough decisions to let go of people because it causes unproductivity in the company. I don't think I've answered your question, but I think that's sort of my views when it comes to sort of managing.
I think you brought up something interesting, talking about workplace culture, and I'm going to zoom into that a little bit. But I think the point that I thought was very interesting is that you see some organizations are scandal filled, with a whole bunch of once it starts to unravel, you just boom, it just unravels, right? Like Enron and WorldCom in the early days, and today, even with Twitter and some of the other, once it unravels, it just whoa, and you cannot believe that. And I think the tone. I mean, I realized something interesting, and I know we realized this in Leaderonomics also. And if you allow, how, and this is a question for you, right? How do we mitigate this, right? It's cultural, but what do we do? Because there's the stick and there's rewards, right? Obviously, you reward honesty, but you'd want it not just to be rewarded, people to be honest for it to get rewards, right? You want it to be ingrained. You want it to be part of the DNA. It's part of our value system, and so on. At the same time, how do you like have the stake, and to what extent? And obviously, if you let go of something small, over time it creeps up and becomes something big, and that's essentially how it unravels in a lot of these companies. It's allowing small behaviors to be unchecked that ultimately resulted in huge issues down the road. So what can you do in terms of culture, in terms of implementing systems, in terms of putting processes in place to enable this to be mitigated at a very early stage and to be completely eradicated to some extent if possible, right? Because obviously, the more open your culture is, the more you're allowed to tell the truth. Because the other piece is the pressure of meeting expectations, the pressure of bringing the numbers, the pressure of all these things, forces people sometimes to go and lie, right? I mean, so your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Roshan. I'm not an expert. I'm just going to share my thoughts. I'm not going to give any sort of concrete suggestions here.
That's fine.
I feel, okay, check and balance. The simple answer is check and balance. I think, when it comes to identifying people, just now I mentioned narcissism, for example. When you're interviewing a person of a high position, these people are usually, there's some research that has shown that such people, whenever you hold them accountable for something, they actually show that their superiority even better. And interviewers like this. Interviewers like somebody who is confident, who is charismatic. Even though we know that some of these traits are, if they're selling themselves too much, it's too good to be true. So as we always, but people can't control this cognitive bias where they are very drawn to such people. Famous people in the past who have brought big countries into grounds. People, Hitler was a highly charismatic person. It was highly narcissistic, and then there was a lot of these things. And people always say, why did we not catch it at the start? This because there's a very little check and balance, I think. And when somebody has done and people who claim more than they do, overclaimers who think that they say that they are good at doing it, but you can see that their productivity is not really there. They should be held accountable. And I feel that sometimes it's really difficult because these are people who are high positions, and it's sort of a difficult conversation to have, and it sort of they let it go and let it slide. So I think check and balance is very important. When somebody is not really performing, the red flags are usually there. If you look at a lot of scandal cases, where people are money and all these things, they always say, on hindsight, the red flags were always there. We just didn't do anything about it because they were scared, because of where, some people say, I've mentioned it, but nobody took into account. I told HR didn't really care. So, again, we need to provide people with some space where they can voice these concerns and it has to be independent, because sometimes if HR reports to the superior, and there's really no way you can, and these very interdependent systems where there's no platform for people to voice their concerns, is when you will see these loopholes and here and there. So I would encourage this check and balance practice where when somebody is not hold people accountable, and it applies to everything. Actually, it applies to our society, it applies to our day-to-day life, holding people accountable, but it doesn't have to be hostile. People always think that you have to be really nasty about it. Not necessarily. You can be quite objective about holding people accountable.
Yeah, no, and I think there are systems in place. I mean, Aaron Dawson just talks about Budaya. It's an app, I think Happily Budaya, where you give the room for people to give feedback directly, anonymously. Those things enable a lot of safety and health, a healthy workplace, to some extent. So thanks for Aaron for highlighting that. And I think the other piece, I think as leaders, I think very important for us to be very conscious also is that how do we create an environment, and we've seen that with a lot of experiments, right? With the Stanford Prison experiments, the environment you create certain behaviors and reactions the robbers cave, the robbers incident where the camping, where the kids were camping and so on. And we've seen many different scientific experiments that say that environment, dictates a lot of our behavior and our reactions and our
compliance. Our culture encourages compliance
correct.
As well. And
I think absolutely. And I think the other thing that's very interesting is that I think many times we forget sometimes the culture of the nation, right? So if you're in a nation where you have leaders who are corrupt and all these other things, and they get away with it, you sort of inherit that culture if you don't design your culture intentionally in your companies and your organizations. The national culture is automatically transferred into your organizational culture. So I think you have to, I think that point, I think you say that very well, is to intentionally design a culture where you allow and empower your employees to share, to say, to open and be transparent, and to be able to have that ombud system where people can just highlight issues and then be very conscious of red flags. Very conscious of it on hindsight, but really it's good to be conscious of it now as we go along. So as we close out, if you were to give advice to our viewers out there, what sort of final thoughts and sort of final nuggets of wisdom that you can share with us for all of us, whether we're individuals in this space of dishonesty, lying, dark triads, managing narcissistic friends, or ourselves, if we are such, what sort of gems of wisdom can you depart us with?
This is sort of putting me on the spot, isn't it, Roshan? I think you mentioned a really great point just now. Culture shapes our cognition, it shapes our personality, and personality shapes our culture as well. So it's really, really interdependent. And I feel that, for us to be aware, I think it's very important to be aware. And I think this sort of self-awareness and the reflective aspect of it is not something that comes naturally to us. We are very used to being spoon-fed. We are very used to being accepting, whatever, in a really hierarchical structure that we have at the moment. So I think being critical about some things is very, very important. It's not about, speaking out means that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but speaking out when you see something that you feel that is not appropriate, and I feel that it applies to a lot of things. It applies to our parenting styles. It applies to our conversations with other people. Just not taking things at surface value, thinking critically about stuff, which is what we always tell our students at university as well. So be aware of it, I think, and share these thoughts with people, and not just comply and be a yes person to everything. That would be
fantastic. Well said. And I think Andrea is itching to get back onto the screen and have a final dig. But see a couple of comments from those of you who joined us. It's been a most intriguing dialogue. And I think we can go on forever, ever, but such is time that it dictates that we end at some point in time. But a call out. I noticed. Even Andrea, you made a short call out. I saw on Budaya and Happily. So at the end we'll show a little bit of a demo on Happily as we close it. But Andrea, your final thoughts as we close today.
I think the takeaway is really clear. For me, I think personally, my takeaway is not to assume whether this person is naive, a liar, or stuff like that. For me, I always look for consistency and inconsistency, especially when when you're dealing with people at work. Their productivity, their deliverables tell you the story, and then you go into the motivations of, okay, why didn't that happen, or why did this happen, and then you understand the person a bit better, right? I think that's my takeaway. Those are my final thoughts on
Fantastic.
this.
And next week, my best friend growing up, unfortunately, I had the I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, but growing up with a person who ended up becoming a psychologist, Dr. Goh Chi Leong from the Real Education Group, kept bombarding me every day with nonsense. But he's going to be joining us, and he's a pretty smart guy, short but smart, and he'll be joining us next week. And he's also I think was Andrea's professor of psychology many years ago. Andrea, any other quick thoughts as we wrap up today?
I think I just want to, call certain things out. We have a Nicole Make a Shift promo code for everybody who's watching here, things to learn and change your behavior and habit on learning and, self-education and development. We also have a 14th anniversary coming up for Leaderonomics. So we have an IG live that's coming up. Do tune in. If you're not following us on Instagram, do follow us. We have exciting showcases of questions and how Leaderonomics was born. And I think lastly is to really thank Dr. Kai Li for coming and joining us and giving so much expert knowledge and also her personal opinions on these things. I think it's been a pleasure and a very great honor to have you on this show. So thank you so much, Dr. Kai Li. I enjoyed your insights, and I'm so excited because this is one of my favorite topics of all times. So thank you so much once again, and for the crowd, thank you for tuning in as well.
All right, so with that, we're going to close with a short little demo of Happily, the 30-second little spiel. It's a great tool for you to intentionally design your culture. And with that, I think, Andrea, when you said you enjoyed this topic, hopefully it's not because you're trying to figure out ways to lie through your teeth and get away with it. But hopefully it's to help build a culture that of openness, transparency, honesty, and love, right? So with that, here's Budaya for you. Have a great week, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and check out Budaya for Happily.